I caught my groom cheating, and instead of falling apart, I decided to destroy him in a way he would never forget. Because no man should be allowed to use a woman's love as his personal piggy bank and then walk down the aisle as if nothing had happened. And I can tell you that what I did turned his fake charm into his biggest downfall. If you've ever carried a secret heartbreak while smiling in public, you will understand why I couldn't stay silent, and if you've ever wished for justice in your own life, then know that your like, or even a small comment under this story, truly helps me keep making these confessions, because each reaction feels like another woman's hand on my shoulder, reminding me I am not alone. So thank you for being here with me. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 34 years old, born in a small Midwestern town where people still wave to their neighbors and share pies at church gatherings, and I have always been the kind of woman who saves for a rainy day, who shows up with snacks when a coworker forgets lunch, and who forgives more times than is wise, because I thought love meant patience and loyalty. When I met Oliver Hart, a 36-year-old investment consultant with the kind of smile that melts rooms and the kind of laugh that makes people lean closer, I believed I had finally found the partner who would see my steady nature as a gift rather than a resource to exploit. For a while it seemed perfect, and everyone told me how lucky I was to have a man so polished and ambitious, and I tried to believe them, even when small cracks appeared. It started with little things, the way he dismissed my opinions with a laugh, the way he always assumed my savings would cover emergencies while his money was tied up in investments, and the way his mother would drop sly comments about how I should be grateful to be chosen by a man of his caliber. I smoothed it over, as women are taught to do, convincing myself that love means compromise, and that once the stress of wedding planning was behind us, he would soften. But the truth is, he only grew sharper, more entitled, more careless with my feelings, as if they were disposable napkins at a dinner party. Deep down, I felt the storm building, but I kept swallowing my unease and hoping for calm. The day I caught him was not a scene from a movie, no lipstick on a collar or strange perfume, but something colder and uglier, a late-night string of messages left open on his laptop that made my stomach twist because they weren't just about another woman, they were about plans, financial ones, strategies to push me into signing documents I barely understood, and laughter at how naive I was to think this wedding was about love. In that moment, I realized heartbreak was not the worst thing he had given me, because humiliation can be healed, but betrayal mixed with greed is poison, and I decided that if Oliver wanted to play games, I would write the final rules myself. After the shock of discovering those messages, I wanted so badly to believe there was some kind of explanation, because it is easier to cling to the dream you have built than to admit it is collapsing. But the very next week, Oliver pressed me harder than ever to cover more of the wedding deposits with my savings, and he slid a draft of what he called a simple addendum across the table as casually as if it were a grocery list. Yet every line of it screamed danger because it stripped away any protection I might have had while shielding him completely. He said it was standard practice, that smart couples always made arrangements like this, but his tone wasn't gentle or reassuring. It was arrogant and mocking, as if only an idiot would hesitate. And when I pointed out that it seemed one-sided, he laughed in a way that felt like a knife across my skin, a laugh that told me my opinion was a nuisance to him, not a partner's voice. I remember sitting there in that cafe with the draft paper between us, my coffee going cold, feeling as though I had just stepped into quicksand, while he sipped his drink like nothing was wrong. His mother made it worse because she never missed a chance to remind me that Oliver was a catch, and I was the lucky one, and she would lace her words with sugary sweetness that carried the sting of poison, like when she joked that women like me should be grateful men like her son still wanted them at our age, or when she chuckled about how marrying Oliver meant accepting that his career always came first. I laughed along weakly because I didn't want to create a scene, but inside my chest was a burn I couldn't put out, and even though I knew it was wrong, I kept swallowing my pride because the thought of calling off the wedding after so many people had invested time and money felt like admitting I was a fool from the beginning. I still moved forward with planning, ordering invitations, picking table settings, even as the voice in my head grew louder, telling me this wasn't right, because sometimes women like me keep marching toward disaster, simply because turning back feels too humiliating. Meanwhile, the evidence of his betrayal didn't fade into the background, it multiplied, and each discovery felt like a fresh slap across the face. I found late-night emails on a hidden account, with messages so careless and smug that they might as well have been written in neon letters. Women giggling about how he promised them things he had already promised me. Notes about weekends away disguised as business trips, and whispers of financial deals that made my stomach churn because I could see how my name and my good credit were the golden ticket he was dangling to impress others. When I confronted him gently, hoping to give him a chance to come clean, he smirked and called me paranoid, as if the very act of questioning him made me the problem, and that gaslighting hurt more than the cheating itself, because it made me feel like I was losing my mind for noticing the truth. He strutted into our apartment late at night, smelling of expensive cologne I had never bought, brushing past me with the kind of arrogance that dared me to stop him, and my silence must have looked like weakness to him, though really it was the silence of a woman collecting evidence and waiting for the right moment. By the time the rehearsal dinner drew near, I had transformed from a bride counting down the days to a woman clenching her jaw so hard it hurt, plastering smiles onto my face at family gatherings, and gripping champagne glasses until my fingers ached, all while watching Oliver hold court in every room like a conquering king. He thrived on the attention, shaking hands, charming relatives, dropping little boasts about the life we would build together, while I stood by his side like a decorative accessory, my heart pounding with a mixture of fury and humiliation. I lay awake at night in our shared bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the life he was planning for me, a life where my money became his weapon, where my kindness became his shield, and where I was reduced to a silent partner in my own downfall. That thought terrified me more than the idea of being alone, and it was in those sleepless hours that the whisper inside me grew into a voice. Something had to change, because if I didn't act soon, I would lose not only my savings and my dignity, but myself. It was during one of those endless nights when I sat alone in the kitchen with a half-finished cup of tea that I began to notice something I had overlooked before. Because while Oliver was reckless with women and arrogant with me, the one thing he cared about more than anything was his image, and the thought of losing face terrified him more than losing me. He could survive without love, he could survive without honesty, but he could not survive without admiration. And suddenly, all the little pieces of his behavior lined up into a pattern that made me realize his reputation was his true weakness. I remembered the way he always checked his reflection in every mirror we passed, how he rehearsed stories before dinners, how he bragged about being a self-made man, when I knew half his bills were still covered by family favors, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If he were ever exposed in front of others, the mask would crumble, and his entire sense of power would go with it. The realization didn't come like a flash of lightning, but like a slow dawn, because once I started looking, I saw how much of Oliver's life was built on appearances, on carefully staged performances meant to impress people who never looked too closely. A neighbor mentioned seeing him at so-called networking events that looked suspiciously like dates, and a coworker hinted about side deals that seemed off the books. And I started to understand that his charm wasn't just a cover for cheating, it was also a smokescreen for something financial, something he didn't want me or anyone else to examine. I began to pay closer attention, noting his flinches at certain words, the way he changed the subject when I asked about receipts, the nervous twitch in his jaw when I mentioned audits, and those little cracks in his confidence gave me the smallest glimmer of power. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of control, the faintest sense that maybe I was not entirely helpless. I stopped confronting him directly, because arguing only gave him more chances to twist the narrative and make me feel foolish, and instead, I started watching quietly, collecting little details, printing out bank statements, taking screenshots, and writing dates in a notebook I kept hidden under the bed. I noticed how often he repeated certain lies, how he recycled the same excuses in slightly different forms, and I began to imagine what would happen if someone else were listening, if his carefully crafted lines were pulled out into the light and stripped of their charm. The idea of letting him talk himself into a corner, of watching his own words turn against him, became almost intoxicating because it meant I didn't have to scream or fight, I only had to be patient and clever. That was when I started to wonder, what if the very thing he valued most, his spotless image, could be the exact weapon I used to bring him down? That thought became the seed of a plan I didn't fully understand yet, but it lit a fire inside me that no amount of fear could put out. I began imagining scenarios where his lies would unravel in front of witnesses, where the mask he wore so proudly would crack beyond repair, and each mental picture gave me strength I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a strange kind of hope, not the naive hope that he would change or love me again, but the sharper, stronger hope that I could take back control of my story and stop being the silent victim he thought I was. It was not a full victory, not yet, but it was enough to make me sit up straighter, breathe deeper, and whisper to myself that one day soon Oliver Hart would regret ever thinking I was too weak to fight back. Once I realized that Oliver's reputation was his greatest weakness, the thought of simply walking away no longer felt like justice, because walking away would leave him free to repeat the same tricks on the next woman, and it would leave me carrying the shame while he kept his polished image intact. I wanted him stripped of the mask he wore so proudly, and I wanted the world to see the man I had seen in the shadows. So I began to imagine a scenario where he would not only confess, but confess in public, with no chance to spin his words or rewrite the story. I knew I could never physically force him to do anything, nor would I want to, but I also knew his ego and his fear of humiliation could do the job for me if I set the stage just right. That thought was the first time in months I felt power surge back into my veins, and it made me hungry for more. I started quietly asking questions, not to Oliver but to people who could help me without even realizing it. A co-worker of mine had a brother who worked as a professional actor in small theater productions, and when I told her I needed someone who could convincingly play the role of a cold, serious enforcer, she raised an eyebrow but passed me his number, half laughing, half curious. When I met with him over coffee, I explained that I wasn't asking for threats or violence, only a staged confrontation in a public place where Oliver would incriminate himself out of sheer panic. The actor listened carefully, then smiled slowly, saying he had played everything from Shakespeare villains to courtroom prosecutors, and he assured me he could deliver the performance of a lifetime. For the first time, I felt like I had an ally, someone who could help me transform my pain into strategy. We spent hours crafting the details because I knew Oliver well enough to predict how he would react to certain kinds of pressure. The actor would carry a folder with blank sheets that looked official. He would reference Oliver's company and his dealings in vague but suggestive language, and he would use the calm tone of someone who already knew the truth, forcing Oliver to fill in the blanks with his own desperate explanations. The key was never to threaten directly, but to let Oliver's imagination run wild, because fear of exposure was a sharper blade than any physical threat could ever be. We decided the best time would be right after the rehearsal dinner, when Oliver would be at his most arrogant and least cautious, surrounded by people who knew him, but who had no idea what kind of man he really was. In the days leading up to it, I played the role of the dutiful fiancé better than I ever had before. I smiled at his jokes, I nodded at his plans, and I even praised him in front of family just to lower his guard, while behind the scenes I was moving money into accounts he couldn't touch and making sure every detail of my plan was airtight. I tested my phone recorder, I bought a small microphone for backup, and I practiced keeping my expression neutral so that when the confrontation happened, I could step in at just the right moment. Every night as I lay in bed beside him, pretending to sleep while he texted on his phone, I whispered silently to myself that soon the roles would change. Soon, he would be the one caught and cornered, and I would be the one holding the strings. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for karma to arrive. I was building it with my own hands. The closer the rehearsal dinner came, the calmer I felt, because while Oliver believed I was the same submissive fiancé who had been swallowing his insults for months, inside me was a woman sharpening every tool and preparing every detail for the moment he would finally trip over his own arrogance. I knew I could not rush this. That timing was everything, so I forced myself to play the role of the supportive bride while quietly sealing every crack he might try to slip through. I moved a large portion of my savings into an account under my own name alone. I froze certain joint steps he had pushed on me, and I secured copies of all financial papers he had shoved in front of me so that nothing could disappear later. The more I prepared, the more I felt my spine straighten, because I knew that when the time came, he would have no escape routes left. The actor and I rehearsed his lines like a script, though the true power would come from Oliver's own panic. We practiced the way he would open the folder with those blank papers stamped with fake company logos, how he would casually drop Oliver's employer's name, and how he would speak slowly, like a man who already knew the full story, so that Oliver would be forced to scramble and fill the silence with his own confessions. He even practiced checking his watch dramatically, saying things like, 2 minutes before this goes to the authorities, and I could already imagine Oliver's face draining of color as he scrambled to talk his way out of trouble. The brilliance of the plan was that nothing illegal was happening, no threats, no real documents, only words and props, yet Oliver's guilty mind would do all the work for us. Meanwhile, I kept my outward routine painfully normal, which turned out to be its own kind of torture, because every time Oliver smirked at me or brushed off my questions, I wanted to scream that his time was coming, but I swallowed it and smiled instead. I listened to his grand speeches about the life we would build. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and I even told him he looked handsome when he strutted around in front of mirrors, because the more convinced he was of my blindness, the harder his fall would be. Silence can be more powerful than words, and I discovered that by withholding my reactions, I made him talk more, boast more, and reveal more than he realized, which only fed the fire of evidence I was gathering. My quiet became a mirror he could not stop performing into, and every performance made him less prepared for the reality waiting for him. The rehearsal dinner finally arrived, and Oliver was glowing with self-satisfaction, shaking hands, telling relatives how successful he was, and standing taller than ever, while I stood beside him with a smile frozen on my face, knowing full well that by the end of the night, his entire kingdom of lies would come crashing down. I excused myself early, slipping away to position myself where I could watch without being noticed, and my heart pounded not with fear but with anticipation, because I knew that in just a few minutes the game would change forever. Every move I had made, every detail I had rehearsed, every ounce of patience I had swallowed would finally pay off, and Oliver Hart was about to face the cruelest mirror of his life, the truth spoken from his own desperate mouth. Before I tell you what happened when Oliver finally met the man I had prepared for him, I want to pause here, because this part of my story is not only about what he did or how I responded, it is about something bigger that I know many of you listening have felt in your own lives. If you have ever smiled through disrespect because you were afraid of conflict, if you have ever bitten your tongue because speaking up seemed too risky, then you already understand the heavy silence I carried for months. It was the silence of a woman who knew she deserved better, but was afraid that walking away would make her look foolish or ungrateful. That silence can be louder than any scream, and I know some of you have been there too, because the pain of pretending everything is fine while your heart breaks is something too many of us have in common. I need you to hear me when I say that you are not weak for enduring it. You are stronger than you realize simply for surviving it. When I sit here now and share this with you, it is not because I enjoy reliving the humiliation. It is because I know there is power in naming the things we were once too afraid to say. Every time I tell my story, I imagine the women listening who might be sitting alone at a kitchen table tonight, staring at bills they didn't create or lies they didn't deserve. And I hope that by hearing my words, they feel less invisible, less isolated, less ashamed. That is why I ask, gently but honestly, if this story speaks to you, please take a moment to like it or to write even a short comment, because those small acts are not just numbers on a screen to me. They are proof that none of us are walking alone in this world. When you leave your voice here, you are not only lifting me up, you are lifting up the next woman who will find this story on a day when she needs courage the most. I think often about the women I have known in my life who carried their pain quietly for decades, who wore polite smiles while being dismissed or betrayed, who believed they had no choice but to keep the peace until the end of their days, and I promised myself I would not follow that path. By telling this story out loud, by peeling back the mask Oliver wore and showing exactly how I refused to let him write my ending, I hope I can pass a little spark of courage to someone else. Maybe your revenge won't look like mine. Maybe it will be quieter or more personal. But it will still matter, because every time a woman refuses to swallow one more lie, the world shifts a little more toward justice. I want you to know that your power doesn't vanish just because someone else tried to convince you it did. And even if you don't feel strong right now, you are allowed to believe that strength is waiting to rise again. So thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart, for walking through this story with me. Your support here means more than I can describe, because it turns pain into connection, and connection into hope. I want you to feel how much your presence matters, how much your small gestures ripple outward into something bigger than you can see. What you are about to hear next is the turning point, the moment when Oliver realized that his arrogance had written a script he could not control anymore. And as you listen, I hope you remember this. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not a scream, not a fight, not even a slap, but the calm, steady truth spoken in a way that makes the liar burn in his own fire. That is what you will hear in the next part, the moment my silence became his loudest nightmare, and I promise it will remind you that justice, no matter how delayed, can still arrive in the most satisfying way. The rehearsal dinner had ended in a blur of fake laughter and clinking glasses, and Oliver strutted out of the restaurant like a man who believed the entire world was his stage, holding his phone in one hand and smoothing his tie with the other. But before he could take 3 steps into the parking lot, a tall man in a dark suit appeared in front of him and called his full name in a voice so steady and commanding that even strangers nearby turned to look. Oliver froze, as though his body had forgotten how to move, his smile collapsing instantly, and the man opened a leather folder with deliberate slowness, pulling out papers that looked official, and saying in a calm tone that there were issues that needed to be resolved before the wedding. The color drained from Oliver's face, his bravado vanished, and for the first time in months I saw fear in his eyes, sharp and unfiltered. The man, who was of course the actor I had hired, didn't shout or wave his arms. He simply stood there radiating authority, and that stillness was worse than any aggression, because it left Oliver scrambling to fill the silence with panicked words. He checked his watch, tapping it once, and said that Oliver had 2 minutes to explain himself before the information in the folder would be forwarded to the proper authorities. And the way he spoke made it sound as though the verdict was already written, leaving Oliver only the choice of how much humiliation he would endure. Oliver tried to laugh it off at first, stammering that there must be some mistake, but the laugh caught in his throat when the man tilted the folder slightly to reveal company logos printed at the top of the blank pages, and suddenly Oliver was babbling, insisting it wasn't what it looked like, which of course made him look even more guilty. As I watched from a short distance, hidden enough to avoid notice but close enough to hear, I realized how perfectly the plan was working, because Oliver's greatest enemy was not the actor in front of him, but the panic exploding inside his own chest. The man mentioned his employer's name, said it would be unfortunate if the board discovered how Oliver had been using his fiancée's savings to prop up his image, and Oliver's voice cracked as he begged for a chance to explain, grabbing at the papers with shaking hands as though tearing them up would erase the lies he had told. But the pages were blank, and everyone around him could see that, which only made his frantic reaction more humiliating because he was essentially confessing without being asked, throwing out excuses that no one had demanded, and exposing far more than the actor had ever needed to say. Then came the moment we had planned so carefully, when the man leaned forward slightly and told Oliver that maybe it wasn't his boss who should know the truth, but Claire's parents, since they might not appreciate hearing how their daughter's savings had been treated like an ATM. Oliver's panic shot through the roof, and with trembling fingers he pulled out his phone, begging to be allowed to call me and set the record straight before anyone else could be contacted. The man handed him the phone and told him calmly to put it on speaker so that everyone present could hear, and Oliver's hands shook so badly that the device almost slipped to the pavement. As the line rang, I felt my own heart pounding, because I knew that the trap was about to spring shut completely, and Oliver would not even realize he was the one tightening the noose around his own neck. Oliver fumbled with the phone as though it were a live grenade, his thumb slipping twice before he finally managed to dial my number, and when the line connected, his voice came out thin and shaky, nothing like the polished tone he used in public, and he blurted my name with the desperation of a drowning man. The actor stood close enough for everyone to hear and told him in that same calm, steady voice that he should confess everything before someone else did it for him, and Oliver began to ramble in a stream of broken sentences, admitting to the affairs, admitting to the lies, admitting that the wedding was not about love, but about access to my finances and my credit. The words tumbled out of him in a rush, raw and uncontrolled, and every syllable carried the weight of truth he had tried so hard to hide. People in the parking lot slowed their steps, some even stopping outright, drawn to the drama unfolding in the open air. The actor leaned in just enough to keep the pressure steady, reminding Oliver to speak clearly, so there would be no confusion later, and Oliver's panic deepened with every second. He promised me he would fix everything if I just forgave him. He swore he had never meant to hurt me, but his voice cracked and trembled so badly that even a stranger could tell he was lying. At one point, he covered his face with his hand, still holding the phone with the other, and muttered that he never thought I would find out about the second email account or the fake contracts, details that had never been mentioned aloud until that moment. The actor didn't need to add a single accusation because Oliver was unraveling himself thread by thread, and I stood silently nearby with my recorder capturing every word like music. I remember the exact moment when the humiliation reached its peak, when Oliver's voice rose almost to a sob as he pleaded with me not to tell my parents what he had done, saying he could not survive their disappointment, and the actor seized that cue perfectly, pulling out his watch again and saying softly that time was running out. Oliver choked on his own words, blurting out every selfish scheme he had plotted, from pushing me into signing documents I barely understood to bragging to his friends that I was his ticket to stability. The crowd around us grew, whispers rippling as people realized they were witnessing a confession in real time, and a few even pulled out their phones to record. Oliver didn't notice. He was too far gone, too consumed by his own terror to see how public his disgrace had become. When I finally answered the phone, my voice steady though my heart pounded like thunder, Oliver gasped with relief and begged me not to believe what the man had said, but it was far too late. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't argue. I simply let the silence stretch as he sputtered and confessed again and again, each sentence digging the hole deeper. The actor nodded once, closing the folder as though the case was complete, and stepped back without another word, leaving Oliver standing there with the phone still pressed to his ear, sweating, stammering, and utterly exposed. That was the moment I knew the trap had sprung perfectly, because Oliver had destroyed himself with nothing more than his own tongue, and I had the proof I needed to finish what I had started. The air in that parking lot felt charged with a strange electricity, as though everyone who happened to be there sensed that they were witnessing something extraordinary, and instead of moving on to their cars, they lingered, whispering in hushed tones while their eyes stayed fixed on Oliver. A handful of people stood frozen with their takeout bags dangling from their hands, while others leaned against their cars, pretending to check their phones even as they stared openly. And soon, the quiet hum of voices grew into a buzz that seemed to surround him on every side. A few even lifted their phones to record the spectacle, because the sight of a groom, still in his polished suit, sweating and stammering as he confessed to using his fiancée's savings and juggling affairs, was too shocking to ignore. What should have been his night of triumph, the evening that marked the final steps toward the wedding, had turned into a stage where he performed his own downfall for an audience that had not bought tickets but would certainly remember the show. The actor, steady as stone, only added the smallest prompts, but each one cut into Oliver like a blade. He asked in that calm, deliberate voice whether Oliver had told me about the other women, whether he had explained how he planned to repay the money he borrowed in my name, whether he thought it was fair to build a future on the ruins of someone else's trust. Each question made Oliver stumble further, his answers coming out in panicked bursts, contradicting themselves in a way that made even strangers shake their heads. He tried to deny, then admit, then backpedal, his words tangling into knots until nothing he said made sense, and the harder he tried to talk his way out, the deeper he buried himself. At one point, he shouted that he had only taken my money because I owed it to him for being loyal, and the words hung in the air like a bad smell, drawing gasps and mutters of disgust from the crowd that was now openly judging him. I remember stepping forward slowly, my heels clicking against the pavement, and the way Oliver's entire face changed when he saw me was a moment I will never forget. His posture collapsed, his confident stance turned into a crouch of shame, and the man who had strutted through every room like a king suddenly looked like a boy caught lying about something petty. Except this was no small lie. It was his entire life unraveling. The phone slipped from his sweaty hand and clattered to the ground, the sound echoing in the quiet as people craned their necks to see what would happen next. He reached for me with trembling hands, stuttering my name, trying to summon the smile that had once charmed me, but his face twisted with panic and desperation, and I felt nothing but a cold, quiet clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations. I just looked at him with a calm that told him everything he needed to know. I was done being the silent, forgiving woman he thought he could break. He tried everything in seconds, pleading, promising, swearing, even attempting a shaky laugh as if the whole thing were some misunderstanding. But none of it landed because the people standing around us had already heard his own words betray him. Every mask he put on slipped immediately, every trick he had ever used to twist. The truth failed under the weight of his public confession. The actor gave me a small nod and walked away, his part complete, leaving Oliver stranded in the chaos of his own making. I bent down slowly, picked up the phone he had dropped, and slipped it into my purse, knowing that the recording now belonged to me, the undeniable proof that could never be erased. Oliver stumbled toward me, his voice cracking, begging me to listen, but I kept walking, each step feeling lighter, freer, more powerful than I had ever imagined. Behind me, I heard the murmurs of strangers, some pitying him, most condemning him, and I knew his humiliation was sealed not just in my memory, but in theirs. His empire of lies had fallen in the most public way possible, and from that night forward, Oliver Hart's name would never again be free of the shame he had poured onto it with his own trembling tongue. The morning after that disastrous rehearsal dinner, I woke up not with regret or shame, but with the calm determination of someone who finally knew what to do, because the truth was no longer just in my heart or my memory. It was captured in cold, undeniable form, and I intended to use it wisely. I gathered every piece of evidence I had collected over the past months, screenshots of his hidden emails, printed copies of suspicious transfers, and now the recording of his own desperate voice admitting what he had done, and I placed them neatly in a folder that was far more dangerous than the empty props the actor had used. With steady hands, I walked into a lawyer's office and explained everything, leaving nothing out, and for the first time I saw a professional expression that told me I was not crazy, I was not paranoid, I was a woman who had been systematically deceived and exploited, and the law could see that too. The attorney assured me that what I had was enough not only to protect myself, but to expose Oliver's broader schemes, and hearing those words was like breathing fresh air after months of suffocation. The legal process was not fast, but it was steady, and each step felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. I filed reports about the coercive tactics he had tried to use, and investigators quickly noticed connections between his behavior and other questionable transactions tied to his so-called consulting work. What had begun as my personal heartbreak was now part of a much larger pattern, and suddenly, Oliver was not just a cheating groom, but a man tangled in fraud, identity misuse, and schemes that could not be brushed aside as mistakes. I attended meetings with officials who studied the evidence carefully, and each time I laid out another document, I felt the scales of justice shift slightly back toward balance. My pain was no longer just a private wound, it was testimony, and testimony has power. Oliver, of course, tried to spin the story, even as the walls closed in around him. He sent me messages filled with half-hearted apologies and veiled threats, promising that if I stayed quiet, he would make things right, and if I didn't, I would regret dragging his name through the mud. But the beauty of the truth is that it cannot be threatened into silence, and his desperate attempts to intimidate me only made him look more pathetic in the eyes of those reviewing the case. I didn't need to raise my voice, I didn't need to invent anything. I only needed to press play on the recording and let his own trembling voice do the work. The same arrogance that had fueled him for years had now turned into a weapon against him, and I didn't have to lift a finger except to hand the evidence over. By the time the case began to gather momentum, it was clear that Oliver's downfall would not stop at humiliation. It would move into consequences far heavier than gossip or whispers. His employer was contacted, his financial records were frozen, and he was called in for questioning, where he tried once again to perform his charm routine, but found it did not work on professionals trained to spot lies. I sat in the background of it all, quiet and steady. No longer the weeping fiancé, but the calm witness who had refused to be silenced. Justice was no longer just an idea I dreamed about in the middle of sleepless nights. It was real, it was unfolding step by step, and it was being written into Oliver Hart's future with the same certainty as a gavel striking would. When the investigation reached the courtroom, Oliver Hart no longer resembled the polished groom who once filled rooms with his charm and loud confidence. He looked shrunken and restless, a man stripped of the illusions that had carried him for so long. I sat in the back at first, watching him tug at his tie and adjust his suit as though the fabric itself might lend him back the control he had lost, but nothing could disguise the fear in his eyes. His lawyers tried to spin the story, claiming misunderstandings, accusing me of bitterness, insisting that the recordings were taken out of context, but the truth was heavier than any excuse they threw at it. The evidence was too detailed, too complete, and most devastating of all, it was his own trembling voice on the recording, admitting to the cheating, to the manipulation, to the schemes. Each time the audio played, I watched his shoulders sink a little lower, because nothing he said could erase the sound of his own words betraying him. The trial unfolded slowly, with witnesses called one after another, and it became clear that what I had thought was just my private nightmare was part of a much larger pattern of greed. Investigators had uncovered fraudulent contracts where he had signed in the names of people who had never agreed, schemes where he had borrowed under false pretenses, and deceptive financing arrangements that stretched back years. Colleagues testified about his late-night meetings and shady deals. Neighbors confirmed seeing him with women he claimed were business contacts, and even his own relatives looked uneasy as evidence of his lies was laid bare in front of strangers. I realized then that Oliver was not simply a man who betrayed me. He was a man who had built an entire life on deception, and the courtroom was finally tearing down the stage he had performed on for so long. He still tried to charm the jury, flashing that same practiced smile, cracking little jokes to ease the tension, but the silence that greeted him was suffocating. I saw jurors fold their arms, shake their heads, scribble notes with expressions that carried no warmth, and Oliver began to sweat through his shirt, shifting constantly in his seat as if the wooden chair had become unbearable. The more he tried to act like the man who once dazzled me, the clearer it became that charm was powerless in a room where facts ruled. By the time the prosecutors displayed his bank statements and the mismatched contracts, the facade had crumbled completely. The mask of the confident groom was gone, replaced by a man hunched over papers he could no longer spin into fairy tales. A man whose entire identity was collapsing in front of the very people he had always wanted to impress. In civil court, I pursued damages for the financial harm and the emotional distress he had caused, and my attorney outlined each instance where his manipulation had cost me money, peace, and dignity. The judge listened carefully, nodding as the timeline was laid out, and when the judgment came in my favor, it was not just about dollars, it was about recognition, about the world finally saying out loud that I had been wronged. In the criminal proceedings, the charges were more severe: fraud, identity misuse, and deception, and Oliver's legal team eventually pushed him to plead because there was no possible way to fight the mountain of proof. The sentencing day came with an eerie quiet, and I will never forget the way the gavel struck as the judge read his fate, each word hammering down the truth that Oliver's freedom had ended. He was taken into custody, his head bowed, his once proud shoulders slumped, and in that moment the contrast was complete. The man who once strutted as though untouchable was just another criminal led away, and for the first time since I had met him, there was no mask left to hide behind, no audience to applaud, no charm that could save him. Watching him leave in handcuffs did not make me giddy, it did not fill me with gloating triumph, but it gave me something I had been craving for months: closure. I didn't need him destroyed, I needed him stopped, and that was exactly what had happened. Justice had arrived not with fists or screams, but with the steady order of facts and accountability, and in that courtroom I realized that sometimes the sweetest revenge is not dramatic at all. It is simply the sound of a liar finally being silenced by the truth. The aisle he had once imagined walking with me, lined with flowers and applause, had turned into the cold walk toward a cell, and that image has never left me. Oliver Hart, the man who thought he could take everything and lose nothing, had finally faced a consequence he could not escape, and I walked out of the courthouse lighter than I had ever felt, ready at last to build a life where my peace belonged only to me. When the dust finally settled and Oliver was no longer a shadow hovering over every thought, I began to wake up to mornings that felt like gifts, mornings that were quiet in a way I hadn't known for years, and that quiet was worth more than all the diamonds and promises he had ever dangled before me. I packed away the last reminders of the wedding that never happened, returned the ring without hesitation, and instead of grieving the future I thought I had lost, I started to build a new one, brick by brick, one that belonged entirely to me. I bought a small condo in a neighborhood that felt safe and alive, painted the walls with colors that made me smile, and filled the rooms not with expensive furniture, but with second-hand treasures and photographs that reflected joy instead of pretense. My mornings became sacred rituals, brewing my coffee slowly, opening the windows to let in fresh air, paying bills with money that was truly mine, reading novels that reminded me how beautiful solitude could be, and each little act felt like a victory. Every corner of that condo whispered, "You survived. You chose yourself. You are free." As the weeks turned into months, the ripple of Oliver's disgrace continued to reach me in small, unexpected ways. Old acquaintances whispered updates about how his name had become a cautionary tale at his workplace, and strangers who had witnessed that infamous night in the parking lot would occasionally approach me with sympathetic looks, quietly telling me that they admired how calmly I had handled what must have felt unbearable. But what struck me most deeply were the messages I began to receive from women, some I knew and some I didn't, who felt safe enough to share their own secrets once they heard mine. They told me of fiancés who drained their accounts, husbands who carried double lives, boyfriends who gaslighted them into silence, and each story was a reminder that betrayal is not a rare tragedy, but a quiet epidemic that thrives in shadows. And every time I read their words, I felt less alone, and I felt proud that by tearing off Oliver's mask, I might have saved someone else from wearing the same chains. Slowly, joy returned to me in unexpected bursts, like sunlight breaking through clouds. At first it came in small ways, laughing at a sitcom rerun, singing in the kitchen while cooking, catching myself smiling in the mirror for no reason, and then it grew louder, stronger, until I felt like I was meeting a new version of myself, one I liked far better than the woman who had once bent herself into silence just to keep a man happy. One evening, months later, I attended a small gathering where the actor's sister introduced me to a kind man she thought I should meet, and though I wasn't searching for love, I noticed immediately how different it felt to talk to someone who listened, who didn't interrupt, who respected my words as though they mattered. I wasn't looking for a fairy tale anymore. I was looking for respect, and that evening reminded me that if love ever returned to my life, it would have to meet the standards of the woman I had become. Around the same time, a letter arrived from Oliver, written from jail, filled with rambling words about how unfair life had been to him, begging me to forgive and to see him as a victim. I read it once, set it aside, and slid it into a drawer I never intended to open again, because his words no longer carried any power. They were just empty echoes from a chapter I had already closed. Now when I look back, I see the story differently. The most important vow I ever made was not one I would have spoken at an altar, dressed in white and holding flowers. It was the vow I made to myself in the quiet of those long nights, the vow never again to let someone else write my story with lies, never again to hand over my dignity as though it were a dowry for a man's ambition. I want every woman who hears this to know that silence is not loyalty, patience is not weakness, and love should never demand the sacrifice of your own worth. If someone tries to convince you otherwise, walk away, because the world will not collapse. In fact, it will open wider once you free yourself. That is the lesson I carry, and the one I leave with you. Don't let a liar convince you your voice doesn't matter, because your truth is stronger than their deception. Oliver's downfall taught me that revenge doesn't always come in flames and fury. Sometimes it comes in the quiet dignity of letting someone's own words destroy them while you rise above it. Today, I stand stronger, calmer, happier, and I know beyond doubt that the sweetest justice is not watching someone suffer. It is watching yourself grow into the person you were always meant to be, free, unbroken, and utterly at peace. And before you go, let me just say this from the heart. If this story touched you, if you found yourself nodding along or even shaking your head in disbelief, I would love for you to hit that like button, leave a comment about what you think, or even share a moment from your own life that this reminded you of. Every little bit of support means the world to me, because it tells me I'm not just speaking into the void, I'm speaking to real women who get it, who have lived through things, and who want to see justice the same way I did. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be so grateful if you did. It's free, but for me, it feels like you're pulling up a chair at my table, reminding me I'm not telling these stories alone. Thank you for being here with me.